also interesting, though, and a quality that we admire about people in general, the loyalty that they have to other people. I found this effort to prepare for this interview today, I found a lot of things about him that I didn't know, and I gained admiration for him, much the way I think a lot of people with President Ford's passing gained enormous admiration for him, learning more about him, reading some of the things that he said. I want to read a quote that I read, which surprised me, because President Bush, I don't think we think of him as someone very outspoken about things, particularly things that might be controversial. And this is a quote which I had never read before until preparing for this interview. He said, quote, "A president is neither prince nor pope, and I don't seek a window on men's souls."
That shows that admirable New England restraint of George H.W. Bush. He's somebody who, as a moderate conservative, is more of a live and let live conservative. He does have a conservative, prudential temperament, and I think that he was the right president at the time. When you think about the epochal change our country went through. Also, I think by 1989, Fred, people were tired of the personal politicization in politics. I think there was an easing off, a pulling back from some of the very strenuous debates about abortion, for example, at that time. Flag burning was a big issue in those days. President Bush had his convictions. He was much quieter about them, and he was willing to let his family members disagree with him. Barbara Bush had very public positions as well. Your parallel with President Ford and Mrs. Ford is apt. It's perfectly apt. There, again, you have people who have strong opinions, and they don't feel that they need to impose their personal opinions on others.
Okay. One other thing I wanted to ask you about, you talked about the fact that he came into power at a very challenging time. I think we hear a lot about President Reagan and certainly the accolades given to him as the Berlin Wall came down. We don't hear a lot about the fact that he had to then pick up the whole new world, and you say he had a very skillful management of the dissolution of the Soviet Empire in Central and Eastern Europe.
It's a remarkable story, and I don't think that the story has been uncovered in all of its nuances. George H.W. Bush deserves our eternal gratitude for the way in which he handled the dissolution of the Soviet Union. If you take period from November of 1989, when Germans tear down that Berlin Wall, up through about Christmas Day of 1991, when Gorbachev resigns as president of the Soviet Union, Bush exercised such restraint, caution, prudence. He realized through that whole period it was important to let the Soviet Union have some of its dignity as it was dying. He saw the Soviet Union will not be the threat that it was. Let it die quietly. In fact, Fred, there was this famous press conference, I believe it was on November 9th, 1989, and the press were surprised that Bush wasn't showing more emotion and enthusiasm and sort of this over-top, hey, we won the Cold War, the Berlin Wall's coming down, we're going to have a new world order. And he was asked by one of the press, why aren't you more enthusiastic about this? And President Bush, and he thought about this beforehand. He said, I'm not an emotional kind of guy on this. Well, of course he's emotional. President Bush will tear up. He's a very emotional guy, but he knows in the public square not to gloat at the defeat of your enemy. Do it with style so that you leave him some maneuvering room, and sure enough, things played out in the best possible way, whereas if you'd had somebody in there who was acting like a braggart, the Soviet Union's hardliners, the Eastern European hardliners could have come back and said the Americans, are going to stick it to us. You can't trust them because they're going to push NATO down our throats. This was the other thing. Behind the scenes, you have some very remarkable negotiations going on where Bush agrees not to push NATO further and further into old Soviet territory. That's since changed, but Bush meant it when he promised that to Gorbachev, and it That lowered the temperature tremendously so that the hardliners in the Soviet Union and Eastern and Central Europe could let the demise happen without firing the trigger.
Yeah, and boy, for anyone who has not been to some of those areas, I had the incredible experience to go to the former East Berlin and to be in a former Stasi prison, talking with a former prisoner who was there for years. It is the experience of a lifetime to realize your country was part of giving a whole new life to East Germans and others. It really is a remarkable thing.
President George H.W. Bush is hailed. When I go back to Europe and talk to people, they have such great admiration for the way he handled the end of the Cold War so that Europe could be peaceful. And it's the same story, we haven't talked about it yet, but what happened in Tiananmen Square in China. You know, there were many people in this country that wanted to have a very firm response against the Chinese when they put down dissidents in Tiananmen Square. And Bush insisted that moderation was key because, remember, he had been an envoy to China. He understood the stakes. The United States and China had come so far since Nixon had gone and opened the diplomatic door to the Chinese, and the big bad communists there had been neutralized somewhat and was willing to cooperate economically with the United States.
And now such an important trade partner, and so many examples of where that was the skillful way to handle it. Gleaves, thank you so much for being with us.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Sorry we ran out of time. We could talk for another hour. Thank you so much for being with us. Have a great night.